Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on Swish City. I'm your host, Bruce Veliz, and in today's episode, we're going to be diving in and exploring another team in these NBA offseason breakdown and season previews, where we go over what a team went over and made changes with their roster, and ultimately going over my predictions for this upcoming year. In this episode, we're going to be diving into our first Western Conference team. We're going to be discussing the Utah Jazz, who over in the Wild West clearly are set towards the bottom here. We're going to dive in and explore what this team realistically could do throughout the season and go over their changes. Without further ado, let's dive in and let's discuss this Utah Jazz team. If you enjoy the content, make sure to let me know what you think down below in the comment section and to stay tuned for your team if they have not come up already. And let's dive into it. So the Utah Jazz are very interesting. A team that last season was set towards kind of the bottom of the Western Conference as well, with extending their star player and Lauri Markkanen. We're set to be in some better shoes, but ultimately tanked and ended up towards the bottom and took a risk as they went out and selected Ace Bailey after falling in the draft all the way from the projected number 1 overall pick to the 5th pick here in this draft. And with that case, Bailey did not want to be drafted to the Jazz, but they took him with the highest upside potential, and that's where things really started to take off for the Jazz going into the offseason. Then they ultimately went out and made an abundance of moves, bringing in guys via trade, trading out guys that they necessarily didn't want to have on this roster to really shape forth and go into this youth movement and be towards the bottom here in the Western Conference. Without further ado, let's dive in and let's explore the Utah Jazz as we break down their offseason. First, looking at the additions that they brought into the roster. So when looking at this Utah Jazz team, there may be some confusion, but I definitely want to include their draft picks that they did end up making trades for. So we're going to dive in and explore all of that in this episode. First, talking about those draft picks, one of them that was traded for, looking at the bottom, discussing Walter Clayton Jr. As you can see, it says a Wizard, but he wasn't obviously picked by the Wizards. He was picked by the Utah Jazz, but they wanted to trade up. They wanted to make sure they could select Walter Clayton, so they traded up from pick 21 to pick 18 to take up Walter Clayton Jr. In return, had to give up an additional second-round pick alongside pick 21, and those two picks ended up being Will Riley and Jameer Watkins, who are over there. Then they also brought in Georges Niang, who was an addition later into the offseason after the Utah Jazz after the Celtics had already traded for Niang, from the Atlanta Hawks in their Kristaps Porzingis deal. He was acquired for Reggie Lewis Jr., who was a two-way contract for the Utah Jazz. They ultimately take on more money and give up a two-way to free up some space to bring one of those guys on, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But ultimately, for the Jazz, this was just them taking on more money because they had someone helping out the Boston Celtics who needed to shed some more salary. They also made that trade. They got rid of some of their veteran players, and this is something that Utah, in past seasons, people have talked about, could have capitalized more on and getting better draft capital for better assets for these in return, because they ultimately, and for John Collins and Colin Sexton, got Jusuf Nurkic, Kevin Love, and Kyle Anderson. 3 veteran guys that don't have much value, now bench players at their best in the NBA. And that's very tough for a Jazz team who had guys like Colin Sexton, John Collins, players that, can be effective on NBA winning teams. We obviously know that. Jusuf Nurkic, the last couple of seasons, hasn't had the best couple of luck with, obviously, the Phoenix Suns getting benched, then going over to Charlotte, not really succeeding there. Kevin Love's gotten older. Kyle Anderson's definitely slowed down a little bit. So for the Jazz, it is once again clear that they are resetting and rebuilding. They obviously traded all their good players for bad stuff just to really hit the bottom and to invest into these younger guys that they drafted, like I mentioned, in Ace Bailey, who they selected 5th overall in this process. Arguably the top 3 player in this draft class, but with his priorities of where he'd want to go in the draft, it really hindered his stock. But I do think for the Jazz, this is the right pick to make because they don't have a number 1 option that they can buy into. We'll get into their depth chart later, how they do have a number 1 option, but this is not the one that they want to be building around, specifically if they want to be towards the bottom. The Jazz need to find their guy, need to do that now. So investing in guys in Ace Bailey and Walter Clayton Jr. are going to do that. Clayton Jr. obviously coming from the University of Florida, that big-time shot maker, winning the winning the March Madness tournament with Florida last year, becoming a national champion, was the heart and soul of that team, that big shot getter, the guy that's going to take over and command for them, and especially in this guard room with guys, which we'll get into it a little bit later within this depth chart. I think this is a player that they desperately need to take those big time shots when the team needs it, because I think some other guys in this rotation room might not have that confidence that a guy in Clayton Jr. has. And then lastly, the two-way players, Elijah Harkless, John Tonje, and Oscar Tshiebwe. Tshiebwe had played with the Jazz last season, getting waived and brought back. He also had some experience with the Pacers. John Tonje was also drafted by the Utah Jazz. He is now going to be on a two-way alongside Elijah Harkless, going to compete. Before the Jazz, like I mentioned, just bringing in some young talent, bringing in some older veteran guys to just fill out their back end of their rotation, to realistically let the young guys let loose and to see who can develop to be key rotational pieces or stars for the Jazz. So with that being said, those are their additions. Let's go and look at who they lost. When looking at who the Jazz ultimately lost, like I kind of mentioned, they kind of gave up on some of these pieces because once again, they want to be towards the bottom. So players like John Collins, who have high trade value, who could go and be valuable for multiple teams. The Jazz could probably get some young talents back. Unfortunately, unable to do so with Collins being on a 1+1 contract. They move him to the Clippers, and in return, they get Kyle Anderson and Kevin Love, obviously in that 3-team deal. They would have gotten Norman Powell, but don't want Norman Powell, because what is Norman Powell going to bring to them? What is he going to really help out and push them to do? Nothing. They want to develop these young players, so that's why they take on the bad contracts and get some draft capital. They also trade away Colin Sexton for Jusuf Nurkic, one of the most puzzling trades in the offseason, in my honest opinion, as I do believe Colin Sexton was valued by a lot of teams at the trade deadline and could have been additional help as a playmaker, secondary scorer, someone to run a bench unit, and for the Charlotte Hornets to get him basically for Jusuf Nurkic, who they got at the end of last season for Nick Richards, and Vasily Micic and Cody Martin. It's pretty easy. Like, the Hornets got Jusuf as a throw-in, and then they give up the throw-in to get Colin Sexton. Hey, that's a win. Imagine convincing yourself that trading Vasily Micic and Cody Martin would get you Colin Sexton. You'd have no belief in that if you were the Charlotte Hornets just last season. So crazy to see that happen. They also lose Reggie Lewis Jr. Obviously, he was someone who was on a two-way contract, but for the Utah Jazz, losing a two-way doesn't really mean that much because they had other younger guys to invest in. Guy in John Tonje, who they drafted, Oscar Tshiebwe they wanted to bring back, so really investing in that kind of makes sense. And then ultimately trading Will Riley, and Jameer Watkins. These players were never going to be on their roster. It was just obviously the draft day trade, but I had to include it because I wanted to display that. But next, let's dive into the free agency and who left there for the Utah Jazz, as we see once again an abundance of names here. Jordan Clarkson was the one that ended up getting waived after some struggling seasons with the Utah Jazz, after some dominating ones within the Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert years, with him being a six-man kind of starting shooting guard for the Utah Jazz in the past. It just hasn't really worked out for Jordan Clarkson. Last season specifically, his numbers were absolutely atrocious, just wasn't that consistent shooter that we have seen in the past, and seemingly has fallen off a little bit. Now, that could be because of his inconsistencies in Utah. I haven't been watching the Jazz. I wouldn't realistically know. But hopefully, Jordan Clarkson can have a little bit of a bounce back season in New York, where he's in some winning culture with some winning players and teammates that are actually pushing towards, being better instead of just, hanging out in Utah and just trying to collect a check. Now, also, the Jazz did lose 3 other players. Now, these players here are either on Exhibit 9, Exhibit 10 days competing for those training camp spots, but I wanted to include those in here. So guys in Jaden Springer, who they got at the end of the season after being traded from the Celtics to the Rockets. He ends up signing an Exhibit 9 deal with the New Orleans Pelicans, looking to make an imprint on their roster, trying to get that last roster spot. Johnny Juzang, someone that the Jazz had drafted and put some investment time in, is also going to be going to the Minnesota Timberwolves, competing to make their either G League or roster. And then also Micah Porter, someone who also has had some long time with the Utah Jazz and had some similar success at the end of the rotations, trying to be, an untapped gem for a rotational piece, is also going to be going off to the Spurs in San Antonio to try to get their last roster spot, or maybe make the Austin Spurs G League team. Therefore, realistically, they did make a lot of trades, but they only lost one key player, and Jordan Clarkson, who was on their roster. Obviously, Springer, Juzang, and Porter all at times had been on their roster, had been two-way contracts, but no longer are there and are going to be competing in other franchises trying to make those rosters, similar to with Utah. And then lastly, their last unsigned free agent, who was someone that was just recently waived not too long ago, either a couple of days or a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago at this point, is KJ Martin, someone who had bounced around the league from the Rockets to the Sixers, now over to the Utah Jazz. He gets waived when his $8 million non-guaranteed contract did come up. This now puts the Utah Jazz at the roster limit of 15 players and still has the possibility of them making some more moves. Now, at this moment, it does look like it is locked with these 15 guys, but we could see throughout the season that some of these veteran guys, if the Jazz don't necessarily need them, could be bought out, could be traded, could be flipped. And the Jazz, even dating back to last trade deadline, were very active in making moves and helping out other teams and taking bad on bad contracts to get draft capital. And that's what the Jazz are going to be doing once again this season, as I predict them to be the worst team in the Western Conference, coming in at 15th. I don't think that's a surprise to you with how stacked this Western Conference is. It just makes sense that I think the Jazz will fall into that spot. But looking at their depth chart, let's dive in and let's explore who could be impactful for this Jazz team this year. So when looking at this, there are a lot of names. Like I mentioned, Walter Clayton Jr., that young point guard, someone that I think from Florida has that confidence to be that shot maker and shot creator for this Jazz team. Something that guys in Isaiah Collier and Keontae George have lacked. No, don't get me wrong. I'm big fans of both players, specifically Keontae George out of college. I really liked his ability to be a shot creator and scorer. But it seems like both Collier and Keontae George just have those tendencies to be hot and cold and seemingly not be as consistent. Now, Walter Clayton Jr. could kind of come into that here as well and kind of resonate similarity. So obviously stepping up to the NBA, has bigger, brighter lights on, has to take more dependency. It could be the same amount of thing, but I feel more confident in a guy in Walter Clayton Jr. coming out of college than I did out of Isaiah Collier or Keontae George. Cody Williams will be looking to make a bounce back season after a not so great rookie year last year. Svi Mykhailiuk's that little bit of a veteran guy in their end of the depth chart. Maybe could be a tradable contract for the Jazz later on in the season. Then obviously Ace Bailey, the guy they're going to try to build around and cater this lineup to. In the wing room with him is Bright Sensabaugh, who had a fantastic summer league, someone in that draft class coming out of Stanford that I was very, very high on as a 3-and-D wing. And if he gets the opportunity in Utah now with guys kind of seemingly cut out of this rotation, it looks like he'll be able to deliver. And I'm very, very excited to see what that can mean for him. And then Slow-Mo, once again, another tradable contract, makes around $6 to $8 million, could be flipped at the deadline for the Jazz. Now, here comes the big question. Lauri Markkanen, obviously, the player that was extended, for the coughing, last season, who could have been traded to the Warriors for an abundance of picks and draft capital in young players and Jonathan Kuminga and Brandon Podziemski, maybe even Moses Moody, etc. Ends up still staying in Utah, now has his bigger extension, dealing with injuries last season, didn't really get to showcase him being that number one option. Still isn't, I think, in my opinion, with them playing through Ace Bailey, is going to lower his trade value. And I think ultimately will end up getting traded by the Jazz, because if he is not, he's just going to be getting benched and rested, seemingly like he has been in the past when the Jazz do to tank. And I don't know if necessarily Lauri Markkanen wants to be doing that, particularly when he's in the prime of his career, where he could still be developing, helping out teams, especially as a really good number 3 option on a championship contender. Please get him to the San Antonio Spurs. But then following that, in this power forward room, they have Taylor Hendricks, who had dealt with some injuries throughout his career, looking to make an impact as, pass first defensive wing that can rebound. He kind of doesn't really shoot, not really the greatest on the offensive side, but helps out in every other way. And then Georges Niang coming in from the Jazz. He's going to be, just your normal stretch 4, hitting some threes, low in the depth chart, maybe another flippable contract for the Jazz, depending on how he plays. Then looking at the center group, Walker Kessler, Kyle Filipowski, Jusuf Nurkic, Kevin Love. Really said it simple. Kevin Love was in trade rumors through training camp. Now training camp's happening. Say he's not going to get traded. We'll have to wait and see. Could be a possibility of getting traded or waived if a team does have the option to sign Kevin Love and he wants to go there. Nurkic is a $19 million expiring contract, could be used at the deadline to flip to get younger assets in, or it could just be held here in Utah and then signed somewhere else at the end of the season. Filipowski and Walker Kessler is the battle I will be watching for, though, because Filipowski has dominated in Summer League, has showcased multiple times, once again, that when he plays on the floor, he can be a dominant shooting big, can grab those rebounds, can be a great backup center. Kessler also coming into training camp is not expected to get his extension, and with his name been mentioned in training in trades dating back to 2 seasons ago with the Utah Jazz with their uncertainty at the center position with Filipowski. It does seem like that Walker Kessler will either be entering restricted free agency and will be getting into this nagging period that we saw with Quentin Grimes, Cam Thomas, Josh Giddey, and Jonathan Kuminga last season, or we will see Walker Kessler eventually be traded and finally be traded after dealing with all these rumors. Ultimately, I do think that this is going to be a very interesting season for the Utah Jazz, as I think it's going to be their first year where they actually get to develop some pieces. As in the past couple of seasons between guys like Colin Sexton, John Collins, Lauri Markkanen, maybe even hinder the development of some of these younger players to actually get in the rotation, find themselves out, and for the Jazz to actually figure out what direction they want to go in. It seems like at the beginning of the years they want to be good with these rosters and they roll them out, then they lose a couple games, and then they just end benching their good players that are making a bunch of money just to play their young guys to ultimately not get the first round pick, something that has really cursed them. So for the Jazz, hopefully this season with new jerseys, with some new players, can be a good one. New front office with Austin Ainge coming in as well, so it's going to be very exciting to see what the Jazz do. I would like to mention before we sign off, the Jazz did make a signing with an Exhibit 10-day contract in Mohamed Bamba, but I did not include it because the Jazz are over the roster limit, at the roster limit at this very moment, so they'd have to waive someone to bring Mohamed Bamba in, and I don't think Mo Bamba can get a two-way contract, so it would realistically have to be probably waiving Kevin Love to bring in Mo Bamba, and at this point, doesn't look like Kevin Love is going to be getting waived unless another team has a roster spot open that he's willing to take as that veteran minimum and to go and play there. Doesn't look like that's going to be the case if it hasn't happened already. So with Mo Bamba, something to keep an eye on. But once again, the Utah Jazz are done here. They are going to be 15th in the Western Conference, so stay tuned. Make sure you catch every team's NBA season preview here on the channel by hitting that subscribe button, and let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. Once again, I really do appreciate all the love and support you guys have been showing, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day, and peace out.